As a last point that we'll cover from Chapter 1, let's consider doing biology. And this will be a theme throughout the quarter as we consider what is the basis for the statements that are made in the textbook. How is it that we know things? And of course we know things because of a combination of experiments and observations. So in doing biology then as a practicing scientist, it's important for you to understand the biologists test ideas about how the natural world works by constantly evaluating predictions that are made by alternative hypotheses. But this doesn't just mean experiments. Important observations are as important as carefully designed experiments for hypothesis testing. This is easiest to understand with examples, so I'm going to go through an example not in your book, and then I'll spend a little time going over some of the points from your book as well. This is a fun article that I'm providing as optional reading on the course website. You're not responsible for anything in addition to what I say in lecture, in the recorded lecture, but I am providing the article in its entirety in case you're interested in reading it. It's very short and fun to read. And so the article is entitled "How Cats Survive Falls from New York Skyscrapers" by a physiologist called Jared Diamond, who recently won the Pulitzer Prize for one of his interesting books. And the subtitle of this article is "Science Can Progress Even Without Controlled Experiments." And so what is the interesting information in this article starts with observing that there is data on injuries of cats falling from different heights. And so why is this? Well, consider just New York City, for example. Every year, hundreds of pussycats fall from windows and are rushed to the veterinarian. Now, of course, the veterinarian, as part of the information that he or she is recording as they are helping their patient cat, then would be what floor do you live on? And so there was a lot of information about the extent of the injuries, whether or not the injuries were fatal, and what was the floor from which the cat fell. And cats, by the way, in general do much better than humans in terms of avoiding injuries and even death to a greater extent than humans when falling. But a couple of veterinarians who were looking at the data that they were collecting on injuries of pussycats that were falling out windows at different heights noticed a very odd relationship, which was that above a certain height, it was actually safer to fall from a higher height than a lower height. That is, a falling cat had less risk of being killed from a fall of 8 floors than 4. This should strike you as very strange. It certainly struck the veterinarians as very strange. And here is a graph of the results. The y-axis here is the percentage of organisms that were killed by a fall, and there are 2 different species that are shown here. One is data for humans, which is shown in this particular graph right here in the dark circles, and here down below is data shown for pussycats, and the x-axis is stories fallen. So if we consider humans first, for example, you can see that there is nobody killed from a fall of 0 stories, which it makes sense that it goes through the point 0, on this particular graph. And the more stories, the higher the height from which an individual fell, the more likelihood that an individual will in fact be killed by a fall. And so by the time one reaches 9 stories, sadly it's almost a 100%, there's approximately 100% probability of fatalities. But look at, for a human, but look at the data for the pussycats. Again, goes through 0. Here's the fatality rate for pussycats that fell 4 floors, and notice that it's a bit lower for pussycats that fell 8 floors. There's less probability of serious injury. So upon analysis, it was realized that cats actually, as they're falling, reposition themselves, and so a pussycat that hasn't fallen very far is still tumbling or is not in a posture that would allow it to land more safely, but after falling the first several stories, then the cat assumes a better landing position and is less likely to be injured. Humans sadly don't show such safe landing postures, which is why they are unable to have this same relationship with stories. But anyway, here are a couple of quotes from the paper. One is that the injury patterns of falling animals provide a homely but clear example of the real difficulties of doing science on problems that don't fit in test tubes. We could gain insight rapidly by throwing various animals and people off buildings of various heights onto various surfaces, but laws in our consciences would block doing such experiments. So the take-home message from this paper then is that one can infer a lot of very important information even without doing controlled experiments by simply collecting data and making very good observations. This is another example of this is actually in the first example of doing biology from your textbook. And that's considering, why do giraffes have long necks? What would be the advantage for giraffes in having long necks? And so the example in your textbook then walks through the logic of testing the idea that the advantage for giraffes in having long necks is that giraffes with long necks would be able to reach food that would be unavailable to others, and this would then provide an advantage to giraffes with longer necks, which would then lead to an expectation of the evolution of long necks in those early ancestral giraffe populations. If that is true, this is sort of similar to Figure 1.7. It's in a different configuration because I think it's easier to look at the data. If this is true, then one might expect that much of the feeding for giraffes is done at sort of higher heights. The investigators who went and analyzed these data found that, in fact, most of the feeding is done below neck height. And so we've got the data shown here, where the axis on the x-axis here shows percentage of feeding bites. We've got males separate from females because the male giraffes are different heights than male and female giraffes tend to be different heights, and so they're grouped separately on different graphs because combining them is a little bit confusing. So we've got males over here on the left and females over here on the right. The y-axis is the feeding height, meaning where were the bites taken by giraffes that were either male or female. And so if we look at the frequency histogram, which is what this is, so this is what percentage of the bites were taken at this height versus that height, and then the picture of the giraffe shows you how tall a male giraffe is versus how tall a female giraffe is, shown here on the right. And so you can see the most common height at which male giraffes were taking a bite is at this height right here, or in the order of about 3 meters, even though the average height for male giraffes is actually much higher than that, and same thing for females. They tend to be much taller than where they're feeding. So this means that one of the predictions of the food competition hypothesis does not hold true. So these investigators thought, well, there might be another alternative hypothesis to explain the evolution of neck height, or at least an additional hypothesis. This shows a typical feeding posture in giraffes. The other hypothesis then that was tested by these individuals was that another possible advantage of having long necks is that this helps male giraffes in male-male competition for mates. And this is an example of why careful observations in nature is very important, because otherwise one doesn't know enough about the natural history to be able to even generate a reasonable hypothesis in the first place. But in observing giraffes in the wild, it was noticed that males would undergo combat in the wild, specifically that they would fight each other by banging into each other with their necks. and that males with longer necks tend to win more fights than shorter necked giraffes. And so, in fact, the data do support these hypotheses. This is probably easier to appreciate if one actually sees the movie. So let's watch these movies now. Here you can see a giraffe feeding, a typical posture, not feeding at the actual height of a giraffe, standing with its neck in a vertical position. Okay, that's enough feeding. Let's go on now and look at the giraffe fighting. So here is an example of male giraffes fighting. So you can see that there are two male giraffes in this particular movie, and they bang into each other. And as noted, okay, there goes one. Yikes. These are large individuals. And as noted in the textbook, researchers have actually seen males being completely knocked unconscious after such blows between these male giraffes, right? They swing their necks and sort of bash into each other. And these interactions can even be fatal. So this is an example then of a evaluation of predictions based on different hypotheses about why, in what way, having a longer neck could in fact be advantageous for giraffes. I'll quickly consider the other example from your textbook, which considers the fascinating case of how do desert ants find their way back to their nest. And these experiments and observations were done in Tunisia. So here's a picture of Tunisia to let you think about the environment that we're talking about. So desert ants in Tunisia then live in these deserts where there are huge sand dunes and the wind is blowing the sand around and so on. And this makes it then very difficult for ants, as you might imagine, to find their way back to the nest. Here's a picture from your textbook. If we look over here, here's the ant nest. And what biologists found is, or observed, is that ants that are out foraging for food, which they will then bring back to their nest, then as they go out foraging, they tend to have circuitous paths, as is shown here by the black line, and so it winds back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Once they actually find some food, however, they go right back in a straight line back to the nest, as shown here by this red dotted line. Now, what I like about this illustration by the scientific illustrator is that it shows clearly the undulations of the sand surface. These can be pretty far, okay? So it's not that the ants can just, look and see the nest and go straight towards it. This is not, the ant is not able to find the nest just strictly by seeing it in the distance. It is known that ants can use the cues such as the position of the sun in the sky to know, to compute direction, and we won't go into that at all, nor does your textbook. But the part of this whole amazing puzzle that is considered is how do they figure out how far to go back? Okay, if they can use the direction, the position of the sun in the sky to figure out, okay, I need to head, this particular direction to find the nest again. But how do they know how far to go in that direction? Very clever experiments here. This is the experimental setup. So this is in contrast to the other ways of, to the other experiments that were being discussed earlier, because this is a controlled manipulation, unlike the other experiments which were just based on careful observation. So if you look at this diagrammatic representation of the experimental setup, then what this shows here, if you consider the nest here on the left, and the experimenters set up specific feeding locations 10 meters away, so that's about 30 feet, right? And allowed an ant foraging trail to be set up here. They collected 75 ants then at the feeder and manipulated the legs in one of three ways. They either cut the leg. They didn't cut the leg completely off, but they cut off the end point. Let's see, if you look here in the middle, this is a normal ant leg. They just cut off sort of the distal or the end point, so that the ant was now walking on sort of shorter stumps. So that was a manipulation to shorten the legs. They also, as a control, left legs the normal length as shown here, and then to lengthen the legs, they glued little tiny bristles from pigs onto the end, so that these ants were now walking on stilts or high heels. And so what hypothesis were they testing by this strange manipulation of changing ant legs? And of course, ants have 6 legs, so they did this to all 6 legs. The scientists were interested in testing the idea that the ants were actually able to use a basic pedometer, meaning that they were able to calculate the number of steps that it would take to get back to the nest. And so what they found then is shown down here in the diagram at the very end. Let me go back here. The diagram at the very bottom of this figure, where if the ants are in fact counting the number of steps before then expecting the nest to be right there, then one would expect this kind of behavior, where after going 10 meters back from the feeder, the number of steps that will correspond to 10 meters, then at this point the ant would start zigzagging. So these ants show behavior where they walk straight and then they start zigzagging in the vicinity of the nest to finally locate with precision the exact location of the nest. I went ahead and flipped this backwards just to make it easier for you to think about the ant walking back from the feeder, then back in the direction from the nest. So don't get confused about that. Here are the results shown here in this particular graph then. If one looks to see how far the ants walked before generating a zigzag, then ants that were on stilts ended up walking too far. So it was the right number of steps, but the distance was too far, because walking on their artificially extended legs with the pig bristles glued on their legs, then the same number of steps made them walk too far. Normal ants walked the correct distance as shown here, and ants with shorter legs didn't walk far enough. So they walked the correct number of steps, but because they were taking little short steps because they now have little short stumpy legs, they didn't walk far enough. So this was experimental verification that ants are actually using an algorithm where they can figure out the number of steps in order to determine distance, to inform them about location of the nest. One final one final manipulation was done with these ants, where they were walking both to the food and back to the food with exactly the same length of legs. So in this second series of experiments, then the investigators manipulated leg length prior to walking the distance. And in this particular case, then the walk back out and back to the nest was using the same length of leg, and therefore one would expect that the distance would be calibrated correctly, because now the length of leg was no longer changing. So make sure you read through these and understand the experimental design and why the investigators were able to conclude what they did.